The Roman Empire dazzles the imagination with its monuments. The Colosseum, the Forum, aqueducts stretching like stone ribbons across valleys. But the brilliance of Rome did not rest only in marble and politics. It rested in the hands of countless ordinary workers whose lives were nearly invisible to history. Among them stood the water carriers, men and women whose labor sustained entire neighborhoods. Their work was simple yet essential: to move water from fountains, cisterns, or aqueduct-fed basins to the homes, shops, and taverns of the city. Without them, the marvel of Rome's engineering would have been a hollow promise, for aqueducts might deliver water to the city, but it was the carrier who placed it in a jug on a table, who poured it into a cauldron for boiling, who filled a jar for washing. To imagine the life of a water carrier, you must first picture the city itself. Rome was a place of relentless thirst. At its height, nearly 1 million souls crowded its streets. Aqueducts supplied fountains and public baths, but not every household had access. Tenement blocks, or insulae, were especially lacking in direct connections. A family living on the 4th floor of a cramped insula might have no option but to send for a water carrier, someone strong enough to climb narrow staircases with heavy amphorae balanced on shoulder or back. The sound of sloshing clay jars on wood frames became part of the city's pulse, as familiar as the clatter of carts on cobblestones or the cries of street vendors. The water carrier's day began before dawn. While most citizens still lay in uneasy sleep, he was already awake, stepping carefully through alleys lit only by the faint glow of oil lamps. His tools were few but heavy: a yoke of wood for balancing jars, the jars themselves of terracotta or bronze, patched and worn from years of use. His clothes were rough, simple tunics bound at the waist with cord, sandals already slick with wear. Sometimes he carried a small cloth over his shoulder to wipe sweat, though the cloth quickly became as soaked as his skin. His was not the dignity of toga or armor, but of necessity, as vital as the baker or the smith, and perhaps more so on the hottest days of summer. He made his way first to the fountains. Rome was dotted with them, placed wherever aqueducts ended in public basins. Some were ornate, decorated with carved stone and bronze spouts shaped like lion heads. Others were humble, little more than a trough catching the flow of water from a pipe. Crowds gathered at these fountains in the early morning. Women with small jars for cooking, children tasked with fetching daily supplies, slaves filling cisterns for their households, and among them the professional carriers. They often jostled for space, for speed meant profit. To be first at the basin was to avoid the waiting line, to fill quickly and return to clients before rivals did the same. The clamor of voices and the splash of water echoed against the stone buildings, a chorus of the city's dependence on liquid life. The carrier bent, plunged his jar beneath the stream, and heaved it up again. Each vessel might weigh as much as 50 or 60 pounds when full. Two balanced on a yoke could easily double that burden. Yet the body adapted. Shoulders grew thick, calves hardened, backs stooped into permanent curves. The water carrier's frame became his advertisement. If he bore the marks of years of labor, you knew he had endured, and you could trust him to carry again. His endurance became part of the unspoken contract with the city. Rome depended not only on its generals and emperors but on the invisible strength of such men. Once loaded, he threaded his way through the streets. The stones beneath his sandals were often slick with refuse, for Rome was no clean city. Garbage lay in alleys, dung from animals clung to the roads, and sometimes chamber pots emptied from windows splashed the unwary. Yet he carried on, one step after another, careful to balance the swaying jars. He knew the shortcuts, the narrow lanes that cut between major streets, the alleys that curved around markets, the steps that led to upper levels of the city. His memory of the urban maze was as valuable as his strength. To waste time in detours was to lose income. Every minute mattered. By mid-morning, his rounds had begun in earnest. Families in Insulae waited for him. Women opening doors at his knock, handing over a few coins, sometimes bargaining for more than they had paid the previous day. He poured the water into household vessels, amphorae for storage, basins for cooking, cups for immediate use. Sometimes he was asked to carry water directly to a kitchen fire, to fill a pot for boiling lentils or wheat. Sometimes a tavern required him to refill barrels, for no wine could be served undiluted, and water was as much a staple of the tavern trade as the wine itself. At the baths, attendants called upon him to supplement supplies when cisterns ran low. Everywhere he went, he was welcomed not as a guest but as a necessity, a bearer of life. His reputation mattered. A careless carrier who spilled water, who delivered less than promised, or who let dirt slip into the jars soon found himself without clients. Trust was his currency. Many carriers developed steady roots, serving the same households for years. A family might know the same man from the time their children were small until they themselves were old. In such constancy there was comfort, for in a city of constant flux where emperors rose and fell, where riots erupted and fires swept through streets, the daily knock of the water carrier was a thread of continuity. Yet the work was grinding. By midday, the sun bore down on the city, heating the stone walls until they radiated warmth like ovens. Sweat stung the carrier's eyes, his tunic clung to his back, and still he climbed staircases and crossed plazas. The weight did not diminish. If anything, fatigue made each jar heavier, and he had little time to rest. To stop too long was to lose wages. Meals were snatched between deliveries. A crust of bread, a handful of olives, perhaps a piece of cheese if fortune was kind. He ate quickly, standing, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before hefting the yoke once more. What did he think about as he walked? Perhaps of little beyond the next delivery, the next coin. Yet sometimes, perhaps, he glanced at the aqueducts themselves, those arches striding across the countryside, and felt a flicker of awe. The water came from mountains miles away, carried by the genius of Roman engineering. But in the end, it came to him, to his jars, to his shoulders. He was the last step in the chain, the point where imperial grandeur met human need. Did he feel pride? Perhaps. Or perhaps he only felt the ache in his bones. For grandeur never lightened the burden of clay. Evening brought no relief until the last delivery was made. Only then could he return the empty jars to his dwelling, perhaps a small room shared with others of his trade. He washed quickly, if water could be spared, and lay down on a straw mat. His body throbbed with exhaustion, but sleep was not guaranteed. The noise of the city continued. Dogs barking, carts rattling, drunks shouting in the street. Yet eventually weariness overcame it all. He slept deeply, knowing that before dawn he must rise again to repeat the cycle. And so life continued, day after day, month after month. No victories were recorded in marble for the water carrier. No historians wrote his name. Yet without him, Rome would have stumbled. His was the quiet backbone of the empire, the muscle and sweat behind the illusion of effortless abundance. As you imagine him trudging through the streets, jars swaying on his yoke, sweat dripping onto the stones, ask yourself, how many lives are forgotten because they left no monuments, no inscriptions? How many shoulders bore the true weight of history? The life of the Roman water carrier cannot be fully understood without considering the physical demands that shaped his every movement. To carry water was not a task of mere strength. It was a test of balance, rhythm, and endurance repeated endlessly throughout the day. Each jar, when filled, became a weight that pressed upon the spine and strained the muscles of the arms. The yoke, cut from wood and not always finely smoothed, bit into shoulders that had long since turned leathery with callus. The carrier learned early to shift his weight with precision. One foot placed deliberately in front of the other, knees bending to absorb the sway of water that threatened to slosh over the rim. The art of carrying was as much about motion as force. Misjudge a step and the jar might crack. Lose focus, and the day's profit would shatter upon the stones. Those who practiced this labor developed bodies shaped by it. Their posture bore a permanent curve from the constant load. Their hands thickened, knuckles broad and stiff from years of gripping clay. Their feet hardened from miles walked across uneven streets. Even their breathing became trained, measured against the effort, inhaling through the nose, exhaling slowly as they climbed stairs with their burdens. Some would sing under their breath not from joy but from necessity, using rhythm to pace their exertion. The tune was often no more than a chant, a murmur that helped mark the steps to a client's door. It was in such details that survival of the trade was secured. The economic role of the water carrier reveals another dimension of Roman society often overlooked. Although aqueducts were celebrated marvels of the empire, most citizens did not enjoy private connections. To pipe water directly into a household required wealth. Senators, generals, and wealthy merchants could pay for such privilege, but the majority lived in insulae where no pipes extended. Their survival depended on public fountains and those who hauled the water from fountain to home. Thus, the carrier was not simply a laborer. He was the link between public infrastructure and private life. His service turned a civic marvel into an individual necessity. In this way, he was part of the hidden economy that powered the city, a reminder that infrastructure alone is never enough. It must be paired with human effort to reach every corner of society. Payment for his service varied. Some clients offered coins directly, bronze asses or silver denarii depending on the quantity and distance. Others arranged long-term accounts promising steady wages in return for regular deliveries. Bargains were struck daily, haggling over price per jar. The carrier had little room to argue, for competition was constant. Too high a price and clients shifted to another man. Too low and exhaustion outpaced earnings. Balance was everything. Families counted their coins carefully, for water was not the only expense pressing upon them. Rent, food, fuel, clothing, each competed for scarce money. Sometimes, in the poorest districts, water was purchased communally, neighbors pooling funds for a single delivery to be shared among several families. In such cases, quarrels often erupted over whose pot received more. The carrier became an unwilling witness to disputes that had nothing to do with him, yet he was often accused of favoring one household over another. His profession demanded not only physical strength but patience with human tempers. The hierarchy of Roman trades placed water carriers near the bottom. They lacked the prestige of craftsmen, the visibility of merchants, or the influence of guilds tied to temples. Yet they were not despised. People recognized their necessity, and necessity earned a degree of respect. The city could not function without water, and water could not reach households without carriers. Unlike actors who were scorned despite their fame, or prostitutes who lived under stigma, the carrier was treated as an honest laborer. But honesty did not spare him from hardship. He rarely rose in wealth. His earnings supported survival but offered little beyond it. Few carriers escaped the cycle. Sons often inherited the trade, continuing the work of fathers, bodies shaped by the same burdens across generations. The presence of water carriers reveals something profound about ancient urban life: the gap between technological achievement and practical reality. Rome built aqueducts that astonish engineers even today. They spanned valleys, tunneled through mountains, and delivered fresh water over dozens of miles with scarcely a slope of decline. Yet, for the woman in the third story of a tenement, the marvel of engineering was meaningless without a man to carry the final 50 feet. The empire boasted grandeur, but grandeur ended at the fountain. Beyond that, daily life resumed its dependence on sweat and muscle. History often remembers the arches and stones, but not the hands that completed the last step. The city itself shaped the rhythm of his work. Rome was divided into regions, each with its own fountains and streets. Carriers often specialized in a district, learning every corner, every stairway, every household that called upon them. Familiarity saved time. A man who knew the quickest way through an alley or the precise moment when a street became too crowded to cross gained an advantage. Over time, carriers formed networks, loosely organized, sharing knowledge of routes or clients. Some even cooperated in pairs, one carrying the jars while the other negotiated payments or alternating loads to preserve strength. There were rivalries, but also camaraderie born of shared exhaustion. To see another man staggering under the same weight was to feel a kinship deeper than words. The dangers of the work were many. Streets were treacherous not merely from refuse but from constant activity. Carts rumbled through, animals pulled loads, crowds surged unexpectedly. A stumble could cost not only a day's wage but health itself. A broken leg meant ruin, for there was no compensation, no safety net. Disease, too, haunted the carrier. Constant exposure to water increased the risk of chills, especially in winter. Soaked tunics clung to bodies as wind swept through alleys, leaving men shivering and coughing. Lifting heavy jars strained backs and shoulders, sometimes permanently. And yet the demand never ceased. Even in illness, men pushed themselves to work, for hunger waited if they did not. To understand his endurance, you must place yourself in his shoes. Imagine rising in darkness, feet already sore before the first step. Imagine bending again and again to lift jars, spine compressed, lungs burning with effort. Imagine climbing narrow staircases where the width scarcely allows your shoulders to pass, jars scraping against the walls as you inch upward. Imagine the smell of the city, smoke from fires, rot from garbage, sweat from bodies pressed together. Now imagine doing this not once, not twice, but dozens of times each day, with no certainty of rest until the final delivery is made. This was his world, ordinary, repetitive, grinding, and essential. As the day waned, the carrier's relationship with water itself took on meaning. To most, water was simply necessity. To him, it was a burden but also a constant companion. He knew its weight, its sound as it sloshed, its tendency to spill when jars were not properly sealed. He could gauge by ear how full a vessel was. He could tell by balance whether a client had given him one amphora too many. Water was his measure of the day, and though it brought him pain, it also sustained his living. In some strange way, he was as tied to it as a farmer to his field, or a shepherd to his flock. As night approached, when the last households had been served and the fountains began to quiet, he sometimes paused to drink from the same water he carried. The taste was pure, cool from distant hills. For a moment he shared in the luxury that emperors boasted of. Water drawn straight from mountain springs, delivered across miles of stone channels. Yet his experience was different. For emperors, it was proof of Rome's greatness. For him, it was survival. He swallowed quickly, wiped his mouth with a rough hand, and lifted his jars once more. And as he walked those final steps home, weary beyond words, one thought may have crossed his mind. How many more years could he endure this? How long before his body gave way? The empire might endure for centuries, but the strength of a man had limits. To see the Roman water carrier in the middle of his day is to witness the intersection of human endurance and the unrelenting pace of an empire. The early morning rush might have faded, but by midday the demand continued, if less frenzied, spread across districts where households called out for replenishment. Mothers with children, bakers needing more water for dough, taverns preparing for the evening crowd, all sought deliveries that kept the carrier moving ceaselessly through the web of streets. His route was dictated not only by geography but by hierarchy of need. A wealthier client, quick to complain or with a reputation for withholding payment, might be served before a humble family in the upper levels of an insula. Every choice, every delivery order was weighed against the delicate balance of survival. Offend the wrong client and one's income could shrink by half. Neglect the poor entirely, and resentment might spread, branding a man unreliable in the tight-knit alleys where reputation traveled fast. At midday, the city itself seemed to conspire against him. The sun bore down with a merciless weight, heating the stone pavements until they radiated warmth through worn sandals. The air shimmered above rooftops and dust clung to sweat-slick skin. To carry water under such conditions was more than burden. It was trial by fire. Jars grew heavier with every step, not in weight but in the perception of exhaustion. Breath came shorter, muscles cried for relief. Yet relief did not come, for the work did not allow it. A pause might mean spilled water, broken jars, lost income. So the carrier pressed on, step by deliberate step, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the sun. His lips cracked from thirst even as he transported the very substance that could quench it. The irony was never lost on him. He carried water, yet often lacked time to drink it. His earnings did not guarantee easy access to refreshment. Public fountains were free, yes, but crowded, and stopping to slake his thirst meant delaying deliveries. To choose between one's own body and one's income was a cruel calculation made daily. Some men carried a small cup tucked into their belts, allowing them to scoop a quick drink when passing a fountain, but many went without. It was a strange existence, surrounded by abundance, yet parched within. Water passed through his hands endlessly, but possession of it remained fleeting. In that paradox one can glimpse the true nature of labor in Rome: service to others, sacrifice of self. The sounds of the city grew louder as the day advanced. Market cries rose in chorus, the calls of vendors hawking bread, fruit, oil, and trinkets. Smiths hammered metal, carpenters sawed wood, bakers stoked their ovens. Donkeys brayed, carts rattled, children shouted in play or in hunger. Against this noise, the water carrier's own labor seemed silent, unnoticed. His steps blended into the rhythm of the streets, his jars clinking softly, his breathing muffled by the louder voices of trade. Yet without his contribution, the market could not function. Bakers required water for dough, taverns for diluted wine, laundresses for washing, perfumers for their concoctions. In every cry of commerce lay an echo of his burden, though few acknowledged it directly. He was invisible, but indispensable. There were dangers hidden in the midday streets as well. Crowds grew thick, making passage hazardous. A stumble in such press could lead to disaster, a jar broken underfoot, a quarrel with angry passers-by. Petty thieves prowled too, eyes sharp for distraction. A water carrier, bent under his load, could easily be jostled or robbed. Coins exchanged for a delivery might vanish before reaching home, stolen in a moment of carelessness. Violence was not unheard of. Disputes over payment could escalate, tempers flaring when accusations of short measure or late arrival were hurled. The carrier needed not only strength of body but resilience of mind, for insults and threats were as constant as footsteps. In a city of 1,000,000 souls, dignity was fragile, yet survival demanded enduring every slight. The rhythm of his work was not measured in hours, but in jars. Each delivery marked progress. Each empty vessel returned for refilling a step closer to the day's end. Some men carried tall amphorae, sealed with wax to prevent spilling. Others bore broad-shouldered jugs, easier to balance but heavier in bulk. The choice depended on client preference and personal strength. Some carriers specialized in delivering to taverns, where demand for water mixed with wine was high. Others focused on households, their routes more predictable, but their profits smaller. Regardless of specialization, the labor remained constant. Lift, balance, walk, climb, deliver, descend, repeat. 1,000 repetitions shaped the day, each indistinguishable from the last, yet each essential for the city's pulse to continue. Consider also the psychological burden of monotony. To repeat the same motions day after day without change can weigh as heavily as the jars themselves. Yet within that monotony lay subtle variations. The faces of clients, the shift of the weather, the change in market prices, all introduced small diversions. Some carriers even took pride in their endurance, boasting quietly of how many jars they could carry in a day, or how far they could walk without spilling a drop. It was competition of a humble sort, rooted not in fame or wealth but in the silent measure of survival. One man might endure longer than another, and in that endurance he found his dignity. When the sun reached its zenith, shadows shrinking beneath arches and walls, the carrier sometimes sought the briefest respite, a corner of shade, a moment to rest the yoke upon the ground, a chance to stretch aching shoulders. These pauses were stolen, for time was money, yet without them the body would collapse. He sat sometimes on a worn step, back pressed against a wall, eyes closed for a heartbeat of silence amid the chaos. Then, with a sigh, he rose once more, reclaimed the yoke, and returned to his endless path. His life was measured not in moments of rest, but in the will to rise again after them. What kept him moving? Necessity above all. Family waited at home, mouths to feed, rent to pay. Hunger drove his steps as surely as thirst. Pride, too, played its part. To fail was to invite scorn, to be seen as weak in a city that valued strength and endurance. And perhaps, somewhere deep within, there lingered a sense of belonging. Though low in the hierarchy, the carrier was part of something vast, an empire whose greatness rested not only on marble and armies but on humble hands that bore the burdens of daily life. His labor was not recorded in scrolls or praised in speeches, yet it was as essential as any decree of the Senate. As the afternoon stretched forward, the city began to change character. The heat softened, shadows lengthened, and the pace of trade shifted toward preparation for evening. Taverns readied for patrons, households for supper. This was another peak of demand. Water flowed again from fountains into jars, onto shoulders, through streets, up staircases. The carrier braced himself for the surge. His body, weary from morning exertion, now faced the second half of the battle. To falter now was unthinkable, for evening clients were impatient, eager to close their doors before night. To arrive late was to lose trust, and trust was the currency upon which all his earnings depended. And as he walked those familiar streets once more, sweat dripping, muscles trembling, jars balanced with care, perhaps a thought returned that had visited him many times before. Was this the only life the empire could offer a man? Was there no path beyond endless repetition, no reward beyond survival? Rome's wealth gleamed in marble, in temples, in processions of generals crowned with laurel. But for the man who bore water through its veins, the empire offered little but burden. And yet he endured, because to stop was to perish. What, then, kept his spirit from breaking? Was it hope of something better, or only resignation to the inevitable? As the day leaned toward late afternoon, the Roman water carrier's burden did not grow lighter. In truth, it often grew heavier, for the heat that had baked the streets all noon long had seeped into his bones, making each step more difficult than the last. Yet, as the city shifted into its evening rhythm, the urgency of households and businesses pressed even harder upon his shoulders. The evening meal was sacred to Romans, whether for the wealthy who dined in tricliniums adorned with mosaics, or for laborers who gathered in cramped tenements with simple bowls of porridge or bread dipped in diluted wine. Every kitchen needed water, every tavern needed to fill its jugs, and every inn required stores ready for travelers arriving at dusk. To fail in these deliveries meant more than irritation. It meant disrupting the flow of daily life in the empire's beating heart. The streets in late afternoon became a stage of organized chaos. Market stalls began to close, vendors shouting final offers to rid themselves of remaining goods before nightfall. Livestock were herded back toward pens, their bleating mixing with the calls of merchants and the chatter of tired shoppers. Crowds shifted from the open squares toward their neighborhoods, creating a tide of bodies against which the water carrier had to force his way. His yoke, stretching wide across his shoulders, became both shield and hazard. It pushed others aside, but it also invited angry curses and the occasional shove when jars knocked against a passer-by. In these moments, tempers flared easily, for Rome at dusk was a city alive with frayed nerves and hungry stomachs. The water itself presented challenges unique to this time of day. Drawn earlier from aqueduct-fed fountains, it had sat within jars that absorbed the warmth of the sun. By evening, water was not always fresh or cool. Some clients complained if it tasted stale, accusing the carrier of laziness or dishonesty. Others demanded more than was paid for, insisting on brimming jars or multiple trips for the price of one. Negotiation became as constant as lifting, for the value of water was measured not only in weight, but in trust. A good carrier defended his integrity as fiercely as he guarded his earnings. To be accused of watering down deliveries, a practice some unscrupulous men attempted by mixing fountain water with less clean sources, was to risk ruin. Reputation was fragile, and once broken, it could not easily be restored. Evenings also revealed the stark divisions of Roman society. Wealthy households received water in grand amphorae, carried carefully into kitchens where slaves bustled over preparations for feasts. Servants greeted the carrier, coins exchanged briskly, sometimes with a token of food or leftover bread as kindness. In contrast, poorer families living in upper tenements depended on smaller deliveries, often carried up narrow staircases, slick with cooking smoke and worn with centuries of footsteps. These deliveries required the most effort, climbing level after level with jars that grew heavier with each turn of the stair. Yet the reward was smallest, a few coins or even a promise of payment later. The carrier, balancing necessity against survival, could not refuse these clients entirely, for in their numbers they made up much of his livelihood. But the toll was harsh. Knees straining, breath short, shoulders rubbed raw by ropes and wood. As twilight deepened, dangers sharpened. Shadows lengthened across the alleys, concealing uneven stones and hidden refuse. Thieves, emboldened by darkness, prowled with keen eyes for tired men burdened with goods. A water carrier, his hands full and his balance precarious, was a tempting target. Though water itself held little resale value compared to wine or oil, the jars and yoke could be stolen, leaving the man without the tools of his trade. Worse still, coins collected throughout the day could vanish in a single act of violence. Some carriers traveled in pairs at night for this reason, sharing both burden and defense. Yet for many, such companionship was luxury. Alone, he had to rely on caution, avoiding certain alleys, keeping to streets with more foot traffic, and trusting in his endurance to carry him home before the city grew too dangerous. The air itself changed as night approached. Smoke rose thicker from cook fires, carrying scents of roasting meat, baking bread, and simmering stews. These smells taunted the carrier, who had little time to eat during his rounds. His own supper might wait until hours later, when his jars were finally emptied and his earnings counted. Hunger gnawed at him as surely as fatigue. Yet he pressed forward, delivering sustenance to others while denying it to himself. This imbalance defined his life, serving needs he could not fully satisfy within his own household. His labor enriched taverns and soothed patricians, but left his own body aching and depleted. There was, however, a quiet dignity in endurance. To walk through Rome at dusk, balancing jars against the shifting tide of humanity, was to take part in the living fabric of the empire. Every street he crossed, every stair he climbed, every fountain he visited tied him into the city's heartbeat. Without him, taverns would falter, households would struggle, rituals of daily life would pause. Though invisible to historians, though absent from marble inscriptions, the water carrier held together threads of survival that even senators and generals depended upon unknowingly. His labor was not glorious, but it was vital. In that truth lay a form of pride, silent but unshakable. Yet, as darkness thickened and his steps grew slower, another thought began to trouble him. How long could a body endure such strain? Men aged quickly under this work. Shoulders bent permanently, knees weakened, backs stiffened. Some were forced to give up the trade before middle age, their strength consumed by years of lifting and carrying. Those who had no savings or family support often slid into poverty, replaced by younger, stronger men who could bear the jars with fewer groans. The water carrier knew this fate lurked in his future. Every step at dusk was not only toward his home, but toward an inevitable decline. Did he think of escape, of another trade, of some way to break the cycle? Perhaps, but opportunities for men of his class were few, and water was all he knew. When the last deliveries were done, when the final jars were emptied into kitchens and basins, when the last coins clinked into his pouch, the water carrier began his slow return. His shoulders ached, his feet burned, his breath came heavy. The yoke, now empty, seemed almost lighter than memory, though its pressure had carved deep grooves into his flesh. The streets at night were quieter, though never silent. Dogs barked, drunkards sang, footsteps echoed in alleys. He kept his eyes low, his pace steady, his thoughts fixed on rest. Home was not palace nor villa, but it was haven, a place to set down the yoke and stretch his body upon a mat, to eat what little was affordable, to close his eyes against the weight of exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring the same burden again, and the day after still. What sustained him through this endless repetition? Was it hope, however faint, that his children might find easier paths? Was it faith in the gods who presided over fountains and rivers, that they might grant protection to those who served their flow? Or was it simply habit, the unbroken cycle of need and response, work and survival, without which Rome itself would crumble? The answer is lost to time, hidden in the silence of men who left no written record. Yet, as you walk with him in imagination, jars pressing against his shoulders, footsteps echoing through the streets of dusk, you may wonder how many lives of the great empire were carried upon his bent back, And how many unnoticed labors like his sustain the grandeur we now admire? As night settled fully over Rome, the city revealed another face, one that the water carrier knew as intimately as he knew the weight of his yoke. By day, fountains gushed, aqueducts flowed, and households clamored for deliveries. But at night the demands changed. The empire's thirst did not disappear with the sun. Taverns filled with drinkers needed water to dilute wine. Bakeries stoked fires for the next day's bread required steady supplies. And public baths, those grand monuments to Roman leisure, prepared for another morning by ensuring cisterns were kept full. In this, the water carrier's day extended beyond daylight, stretching into hours that most would call rest. For him, there was no true boundary between work and night, only an unbroken thread of duty. The sounds of Rome at night formed a new kind of rhythm. The clatter of carts softened, though some still creaked over cobblestones under lantern light. The cries of market sellers gave way to laughter spilling from tavern doors and the occasional clash of raised voices as drink loosened tongues and tempers. Dogs barked, horses snorted, and the faint hum of pipes and aqueducts carried through the air. For the water carrier, these sounds were both company and warning. The streets were not empty, but they were unpredictable. A man carrying jars in the dark was at once essential and vulnerable, part of the city's pulse yet marked as prey to anyone desperate enough to take from him. The dangers were not only human. The stones underfoot, worn smooth by centuries of traffic, became treacherous when unseen. A misplaced step could topple a jar, shattering clay and spilling hard-earned wages across the street. Even a stumble could wrench his shoulders or strain his back beyond repair. Injury meant more than pain. It meant the loss of work, and with it, the loss of survival. Thus, he learned to move with caution, balancing weight as carefully as a dancer, measuring each step even when exhaustion pressed him to hurry. His body became an instrument of calculation, every muscle trained to preserve the fragile balance between endurance and collapse. Yet there were moments of unexpected beauty in these nocturnal hours. A fountain gurgling under moonlight seemed more serene than during the day, its flow steady and patient, its basin shimmering with reflections of stars. The Tiber, often foul with refuse and filth, gleamed in the pale glow of lamps upon its bridges. In the quiet spaces between taverns and tenements, Rome revealed itself as a place of contrasts, a city of grandeur and grime, of temples and alleyways, of power and poverty. The water carrier, though burdened, bore witness to this silent duality. His role, humble as it was, tied him to both sides of Rome, serving patricians who feasted on silver and plebeians who ate from wooden bowls. The late hours brought him into contact with those whose labors mirrored his own. Bakers emerged from their ovens, faces flushed, sweat dripping, preparing bread that would feed the city by dawn. Street sweepers dragged brooms across littered alleys, pushing aside the detritus of 1,000 footsteps. Night guards patrolled gates, their cloaks wrapped tightly against the chill, their eyes sharp for intruders or troublemakers. Each man performed his task without fanfare, unseen by those who reaped the benefits. Together, they formed the invisible foundation of Rome's survival, a web of effort stretched across time and space. To speak of empire without them was to tell only half the truth. His clients at night were different too. Tavern owners greeted him with urgency, their voices loud over the din of patrons inside. Bakers paid quickly, knowing delay could cost them loaves. The poorest households, however, begged for deliveries even at late hours, sometimes offering little in return. The water carrier faced choices each night: refuse and risk anger, or agree and bear the weight of charity he could scarcely afford. Some nights he relented, moved by pity for children crying in dark rooms. Other nights necessity hardened him, forcing him to turn away. Such choices carved themselves into his conscience, shaping a man torn between survival and compassion. The economics of night labor were harsher too. By day, water could be sold at consistent prices, but at night desperation altered the balance. Some clients offered more, recognizing the strain of late delivery. Others tried to pay less, arguing that the carrier had fewer customers competing for his attention. Each transaction became negotiation, another weight upon his mind even as jars strained his shoulders. Coins, though small, held immense power in these exchanges. A single denarius might mean the difference between a family eating meat or subsisting on grain for a week. Every clink in his pouch carried both relief and responsibility. As the hours drew closer to midnight, his exhaustion reached its peak. Muscles screamed with every lift, shoulders ached from deep grooves pressed by the yoke, and his breath came shallow, labored. His body longed to stop, to drop the burden and collapse onto the nearest stoop. Yet he pressed forward, driven by habit, by obligation, by the knowledge that rest would come only once his jars were empty and his path home secure. The discipline of repetition became his shield. He had done this yesterday, he would do it tomorrow, and so he did it tonight, one step at a time. But beneath this discipline lay a haunting thought. What did it mean for a man to live unseen? Emperors were remembered in marble, generals in triumphs, senators in scrolls, but water carriers left no monuments. Their stories were etched only in the fleeting memory of those they served, forgotten as quickly as the jars were emptied. Yet without them the empire's daily life would falter. The contradiction gnawed at him even if he lacked the words to express it. He was essential and invisible at once. Could one exist without the other? Could Rome's grandeur have survived without such obscured hands? At last, when the final errands were finished and the city grew quieter still, he began his walk home. The path was not safe, but it was familiar. He passed fountains where water still flowed, their marble faces worn smooth, gods and nymphs watching silently as he trudged past. He crossed alleys where shadows clung thick, listening for the scrape of footsteps that might signal danger. He skirted the river, smelling its damp breath, hearing its steady current in the darkness. Each landmark brought him closer to the small space he called home, closer to the mat that would hold his tired body, closer to the brief rest before the cycle began anew. When he finally set down the yoke and leaned the jars against the wall, a silence enveloped him. The absence of weight was almost disorienting, as though the air itself lifted him upward. He ate what food he had, simple and plain, more fuel than feast. He drank sparingly, careful to preserve what remained. Then he lay down, his body sinking into rest like a stone into water. Outside, Rome still murmured, still shifted, still lived. Inside, he drifted into sleep, knowing the dawn would summon him once more to the fountains, to the jars, to the streets. His life was repetition, but repetition was survival. And yet as he closed his eyes, the question lingered. How many others had walked this same path before him, and how many more would follow after? Their names forgotten, their labor unseen, their strength consumed by the endless thirst of Rome. The water carrier awoke before dawn, his body still aching from the previous night, yet already drawn by the rhythm that defined his existence. There was no luxury of lingering in bed, no hesitation to delay the inevitable. The city stirred early, and he had to stir earlier still. Rome never waited for those who served it. The air was damp and cool, thick with the faint scent of ashes from the night's fires and the sour traces of refuse left uncollected. These smells were ordinary to him, as much a part of life as the wooden yoke leaning by the wall, awaiting its burden. He rose, stretched sore limbs, and prepared himself for another cycle of endless labor. The first task was always preparation. He checked the condition of his amphorae, ensuring none had cracked or leaked during the night. Clay vessels were both tools and liabilities, strong enough to hold water but fragile enough to betray him at the smallest misstep. Each carried not just water, but livelihood. He tied cords securely, adjusted the padding on his yoke, and rubbed his shoulders as though rehearsing for the weight they would soon bear. These rituals, though dull, were survival itself. A careless error could mean broken jars, spilled water, lost wages, or worse, injury that might cripple him forever. In this way, the dullest routines became sacred protections. The streets in the gray light of dawn were quieter but far from empty. Other workers emerged alongside him, each heading toward their own burdens. The baker's apprentice hurried with sacks of grain. The potter inspected his kiln, the farmer's cart rattled toward the market. They did not exchange much beyond nods or brief greetings, for each knew the other's weariness too well. Words were spared, energy conserved, yet in those silent exchanges lay a fellowship deeper than words. All belonged to the same unseen order, the laborers who powered the empire from the shadows. His first destination was a fountain fed by one of the aqueducts. Water gushed steadily from carved stone mouths, the sound steady and soothing, yet also commanding. This flow, engineered by distant arches and channels, was the lifeline of Rome. For the water carrier, it was both beginning and end, origin of his toil and measure of his day. He bent to fill his amphorae, steadying them as the cold stream rushed in, watching as liquid life displaced air, heavy clay becoming heavier still. The act was repetitive, yet he could not allow his mind to wander. A jar filled too quickly might crack, one lifted carelessly might slip, and every mistake cost more than he could spare. Once the jars were balanced across his shoulders, the true test began again. Step by step he set out across cobbled paths, each stone worn uneven by centuries of use. The weight pressed into his bones, yet he bore it as he had yesterday, and as he would tomorrow. The city, still half asleep, began to wake around him. Curtains opened in insulae windows. Voices rose faintly. The smell of smoke thickened as hearths lit anew. For the water carrier, this was the moment of blending into the pulse of Rome. He was not separate from it. He was its very movement, its living conduit between fountains and households. As the sun crept higher, demand increased sharply. Families called out for deliveries, women bargained in courtyards, children ran with empty cups, eager to be first. The water carrier wove through these calls with practiced patience, distributing according to agreement and coin. Yet the work was not mechanical. Each client had habits, moods, expectations. Some demanded silence, others demanded conversation. Some pressed coins into his palm with gratitude, others with disdain, as if his presence were an intrusion. He endured both alike, for the water cared nothing for dignity. It only flowed, and he with it. The wealthier districts presented new challenges. There, marble courtyards gleamed, mosaic floors glittered, and slaves outnumbered free men. To deliver water here was to glimpse another Rome, one of ease and luxury. Jars were emptied into basins too fine for his calloused hands. Fountains splashed where water was not necessity but ornament, and gardens bloomed where thirst was satisfied before it was even felt. He entered these spaces as a shadow, tolerated but never acknowledged as equal. To the wealthy, water was simply expected, as constant as the rising sun. The labor behind it remained invisible, its carriers as unremarkable as the clay jars they bore. He accepted this invisibility because refusal was impossible. Survival demanded silence, and yet within these differences lay a truth that he could not ignore. The same water that filled golden cups in patrician villas also quenched the thirst of paupers in narrow alleys. The same aqueduct that supplied senators supplied slaves. The carrier himself, though lowly, was the bridge between these extremes. He moved fluid across boundaries of wealth and status, binding the city in ways unseen. This knowledge gave him neither pride nor comfort, but it gave him clarity. Without such humble exchange, the grandeur of Rome would dry into dust. As the day wore on, fatigue accumulated like stones in a pouch. Shoulders sagged, legs stiffened, yet still he moved. He stopped only briefly for bread or olives, eaten quickly in shaded corners before resuming his route. Rest was never complete, only paused. Hunger was constant, but so too was thirst, not of his own, but of the city. He carried water for others while rationing his own sips, careful not to waste what could be sold. This irony weighed heavier than his jars. To quench others while remaining. Parched himself was the definition of his place, necessary yet never fulfilled. Toward afternoon, as the heat rose, the city grew restless. Crowds thickened at fountains, tempers sharpened in the sun. Water demand spiked as baths prepared for patrons and cooks prepared for meals. The water carrier moved quickly, straining his body to meet rising need. Here, efficiency became as valuable as endurance. A missed delivery meant angry clients, lost coins, or replaced services. Rome was vast, and if one carrier faltered, another stood ready to take his place. Competition sharpened every moment, pressing him onward even when his strength waned. In this crucible of exhaustion and necessity, he sometimes wondered about freedom. Was there a life beyond the yoke, beyond clay jars and endless steps? Could a man rise from such labor to another station, or was he bound by it as surely as water, flowed downhill? Dreams surfaced occasionally, of land tilled by his own hands, of rest unbroken by demands, but they dissolved quickly, washed away by the current of reality. His world was weight and water, and he bore both as fate. As evening approached again, his pace slowed, not from choice but from sheer depletion. Deliveries completed, jars lighter, coins gathered, he began his return to the fountain for the final refill. Shadows lengthened, lamps flickered, voices shifted from work to leisure. He watched as others settled into rest while his labor still continued. This divide was stark, yet he had ceased to resent it. What good was resentment against necessity? Better to endure, to walk, to carry, until the day was finished and night embraced him once more. And still, as he crossed the final stretch, another thought clung to him. How many footsteps like his had echoed on these same stones? How many men had carried the same burdens, unseen, unremembered, sustaining Rome in silence? And if their lives vanished into obscurity, what would remain of his? Would history ever whisper of those who bore the empire's thirst, or would their existence dissolve like spilled water on the ground? The seventh stretch of the water carrier's day was always the cruelest, when body and spirit wavered, but duty continued to pull him forward. Night descended upon Rome, But unlike the wealthy who retreated into banquets, laughter, or rest, his labor extended into hours that many never witnessed. In this twilight the city changed. The market stalls folded away, the noise of commerce faded, and shadows deepened between walls that in daylight seemed familiar. The water carrier knew these hours intimately, not as moments of respite but as the continuation of endless service. The torches of watchmen flickered at corners, their light casting more unease than comfort. In dim glow, the stones of the streets became treacherous. Each uneven edge threatened his footing. Each turn of the road held possibility of stumbling. His jars, though lighter than in morning, still bore enough weight to break him if mishandled. Every step required attention sharpened by exhaustion, a paradox that ground upon his mind. He longed to relax into rhythm, yet dared not. To falter now, so near the end, could undo the entire day. The nighttime city breathed differently. Voices shifted from bargaining cries to murmured confidences. Taverns swelled with patrons, their songs rising drunkenly into the night, echoing down alleys where the carrier passed in silence. Laughter, though distant, pressed upon him as a reminder of a life he would never know. Leisure belonged to others, not to him. His role was not to sit with wine, but to deliver the water from which wine itself was mixed. Every sound became reminder of his station, part of the city's fabric but never of its pleasures. There were still customers even at this hour, households that had delayed, taverns that required more, bakers preparing for dawn's loaves. These clients demanded urgency, for without water their own work could not proceed. The carrier complied, though his body begged otherwise. Each transaction stretched time further. Each delivery extended his weariness into something almost unbearable. Yet refusal was unthinkable. Coins gathered at night could mean bread tomorrow, or oil for lamps, or rent to prevent eviction from his dwelling. The balance was cruel but absolute. To stop was to lose, and to lose was to starve. In the quiet of night, another presence pressed itself upon him. Memory. He recalled the first days of his work, when youth made the burden seem conquerable, when each jar carried felt like proof of strength rather than inevitability. Those days were long gone. Now he measured time not in seasons or years, but in rotes repeated endlessly, deliveries made and remade. Life had become circular, each dawn resembling the last. In this monotony lay a dull despair, yet also a strange permanence. Rome changed, rulers came and went, but water still flowed, and men like him still bore it. He was both forgettable and eternal. As he crossed a bridge, he paused briefly to adjust his yoke. The river below glimmered faintly in moonlight, its current steady and patient. Unlike him, the river moved without exhaustion, without demand, its flow endless. He envied that simplicity. For him, water was always weight, always labor. For the river, it was freedom. He wondered if men upstream or downstream thought of him at all, or if his existence mattered only in the clink of coins exchanged for jars delivered. Did Rome recognize the millions of footsteps required to sustain its grandeur, or did it remember only the arches and emperors? The night deepened further, and with it came unease. Darkness hid danger that daylight softened. Stray animals, desperate thieves, drunken wanderers, all posed threats. A man carrying jars was vulnerable, his hands occupied, his pace slowed. He knew others who had been robbed, beaten, left with broken vessels and broken bones. Yet he walked regardless because walking was all he had. The choice between risk and hunger was no choice at all. His safety was secondary to obligation. When he neared his dwelling once more, the exhaustion in his body felt almost detached, as though it belonged to another. Shoulders burned, legs trembled, yet his mind floated beyond sensation, focused only on the promise of release. The jars were emptied for the last time. The yoke leaned against the wall once again. The cycle had closed, not with triumph, but with survival. Tomorrow it would begin again, as certain as sunrise. He collapsed onto his bedding, too weary for thought. Yet a question lingered even in half-sleep. Would anyone, in centuries to come, recall the men who carried Rome's water? Or would they vanish into silence, forgotten like spilled drops on the stones? The final hours of the water carrier's day arrived not with ceremony but with silence. The city outside still stirred with life. Voices from taverns, wheels of late carts rolling, distant songs fading into alleys, but inside his cramped dwelling, quiet, pressed down like a blanket. The jars leaned in a corner, streaked with dust, the yoke resting heavily against the wall. These objects were not possessions in the usual sense. They were extensions of his very body, instruments that defined his existence. Without them, he was no one. With them, he was still no one, but a useful one. Rome's streets drank through his effort, though Rome itself never thanked him. Lying upon straw that crackled beneath his weary limbs, he reflected dimly, though exhaustion blurred thought into haze. What had the day been? A repetition. Water drawn, carried, delivered. Steps measured, coins exchanged. The sameness dulled time, yet also marked his endurance. Each day survived was victory of a kind. He had not collapsed in the street. He had not lost his jars. He had not been robbed or broken by the burden. To endure was his triumph, though no one cheered for it. Beyond his window, the city's aqueducts stretched unseen through the dark. They were Rome's marvels, praised in speeches, etched into stone, admired by travelers from lands far away. Yet the aqueduct did not place water at a baker's door or a tavern's table. That task fell to men like him, unrecorded, unnamed. He was the silent bridge between grandeur and necessity, between engineering wonder and the thirst of a household. Without his footsteps, the miracle of flowing water remained out of reach for many. He wondered if the scholars and senators who praised Rome's greatness considered men like him when they spoke of order and empire. As sleep crept upon him, he imagined how history might remember. Emperors would be carved in marble, generals chronicled in scrolls, aqueducts described in detail by future generations. But the men who bent their backs to carry jars would vanish into shadows, their names never written, their toil dissolved like drops spilled on stones. This thought carried both bitterness and strange peace. To be forgotten was inevitable. Yet perhaps invisibility itself was proof of success. If Rome functioned smoothly, it was because his kind had labored so well they left no trace of interruption. To be invisible was to have done the job. The day closed fully, darkness folding over him, his breathing slow and heavy. He had no illusions of change. Tomorrow the jars would be lifted again, the yoke pressed to his shoulders, the streets walked until his bones ached. It would not differ from today, or from yesterday. That was life's rhythm, unremarkable but steady. Still, a question lingered quietly as he drifted into sleep. Would the world, centuries hence, pause to wonder at the unseen laborers who made empires thrive? Or would it only gaze upon arches and palaces, never knowing the weight of a jar carried in silence? And in that question lies the thread that connects his forgotten life to ours. For history, at its core, is not only emperors and monuments. It is footsteps in dust, jars upon shoulders, water carried through the night. Without the countless invisible carriers, there would have been no Rome to admire at all.